Hi, my name is Kimberly Wiggins, and I am presenting my spirituality and social work um, interview with you today. So, welcome. Thanks for joining. Um, so, just here, my name. I was going to make this a little bit wider too. Um, so, going a little bit over the biopsychosocial assessment. My interviewee name, I went by Wendy. Obviously, that is not her real name. Um, Biologically, she is a 50-year-old female. She works as a clinical director for a dual diagnosis treatment facility. She has an autoimmune disorder that affects her weight and makes her fatigue often. She has a past history of drug and alcohol use and family history of mental health. And so she endorses mental health issues as well and is on medication for depression and anxiety. The psychological part of the biopsychosocial assessment, she has had a past history of suicidal thoughts when she was drinking heavily. When she's sober, those suicidal thoughts don't exist for her. She sees herself as a strong and independent, but she does struggle with mental health issues at times. There is none currently, and she tends to not have them when she's not drinking. And she's been sober, I think, 25 years is what she said. So they don't exist as frequently, but she does endorse some seasonal depression too. So especially this time, some anxiety or some depression or just easily irritable and low frustration tolerance. Sometimes that just takes over a little much, or a little too much for her. She went for dual diagnosis treatment in 2000, and like I said, she has been sober since, so there were no relapses for her when she got sober. Let's see. Socially, she identifies as a Buddhist, and she's been practicing Buddhism for about 20 years, and she didn't start getting into it pretty heavily until about 20 years, but she started broaching what Buddhism looked like. She is heavily involved in her AA, which is Alcoholics Anonymous, which is a sober support group for people who are struggling with the disease of addiction. She is currently single. She does have 4 children, but she only lives with one of her 4 children. Let's see. So one of the questions I ask is, how would you describe yourself in terms of your specific religious beliefs or spiritual path or faith? And quote, I call my higher power God and live by the Buddhist principles. So she gave a lot of gratitude to the spiritual recovery program, Refuge Recovery, which is a Buddhist approach to those healing from addiction. It's not a Buddhist approach to the 12 steps if you're in recovery, but it's just a way to practice. And it has a lot to do with, instead of when we avoid our pain, we create a lot of unnecessary suffering for ourselves. So it's really asking us to walk through some of that pain and understanding that a lot of our suffering comes from attachments and cravings. And I'll explain a little bit more in that as we go. So I want to talk a little bit about Buddhism. So according to Frame, which is one of the books in our criteria that we've been reading about, says Buddhism is the world's largest great religions, claiming 150 to 300 million followers. Siddhartha Gautama, known as the Buddha or Enlightened One, founded it in northeastern India. So some of the basic Buddhist beliefs are the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. So the Four Noble Truth is that there is suffering, so that we acknowledge that that exists in our world, and there's no way to avoid it, right? Avoiding it just makes it worse. That suffering is caused by our desire and attachment and our cravings. So people in recovery really connect to the craving part. But you can do that with, material things, craving what's new and what someone has put on the market. And a lot of times you see that too, like you get it, and then all of a sudden the value of that is not as great as it was before you had it. Suffering can be overcome. They call this nirvana, by ceasing to desire. I believe Carl Jung said, there is no coming into consciousness without pain. So I could backtrack a little bit, that there's no way to avoid it, and we fight really hard, and we deny reality, and that makes our situation far worse. And the last noble truth here is the way to end desire is to follow the Eightfold Path. So I'm going to go over the Eightfold Path with you, so that we have right intention, so that we wake up daily to be intentional about our day. And I usually will ask a lot of my clients, and even myself, is what is my intention today? Is my intention to be kind? Is it to be forgiving? Is it to be compassionate? And so that's one of the Eightfold Paths, right opinion. And in my view of that, I believe that at times when we're overly opinionated, it creates a lot of interpersonal effectiveness. So we have to know when I think it's necessary to have a certain opinion, and how strong we need that to be, and how that can affect others. So right conduct, so acting in a way that's integrate, the right livelihood, right effort is, what kind of effort am I putting into a situation, and is it something that I need to be focused on? Is that where my focus needs to be at this moment? Right mindfulness, how do I live mindfully each day? And when I'm not mindful, am I creating more suffering in my life? And right concentration, where am I putting my concentration? Is it on others? Is it on situations? Or is it on myself and what I'm doing each day? So that was just an understanding a little bit about the spirituality that she follows. And so now I'm going to go back a little bit to the journey of the spiritual connection that she has been walking for the past 20 to 25 years. So she quotes, because of my disease, alcoholism, I found myself in rehab in 2000, and my journey began when I started to get sober. So she explained her disease took her to a place of spiritual disconnection, and she was spiritually void. So she made a decision to turn her will and her life over to God, and ever since then she's been sober, and has been living a life that is worth living to her. And when we're in the throes of addiction, we're very misaligned with our value system. So I thought it was interesting to ask her, what does dying mean to her? And the reason I decided to do this was because in other religions, if you don't follow those certain traditions or beliefs, with those religions, there's a final to that, right? Like in Christianity, if you don't get saved or you don't believe Jesus is the way, the truth, the light, then you don't go to heaven. So I find it interesting when people say that they're spiritual, what does that look like for them? And in all reality, I think we don't know. I mean, no one has really survived to tell us. So, so I thought it was important to get her perspective of what that looked like. So she said, I believe it is about spiritually moving into another realm. I don't necessarily know what that entails, but I believe it to be peaceful and full of kindness. So it was an interesting perspective of really what happens after this life. And coming from someone who practices Buddhism was interesting for me. And so the question here that, we were required to do was, what should social workers know about social work and spirituality? And so how she explained it was having a religious or spiritual foundation gives a person meaning or purpose in tough times. It can be a strength that people lean into to find peace and comfort in times of chaos. And she also went on to report that if we're spiritually void or spiritually disconnected, it's not possible to be sober. So people that have a lot of experience in AA really believe that if there isn't that spiritual connection, that we're living as a dry drunk, is the way that they would call it. Like, I haven't changed, like any of my values or my beliefs or my ways or my opinions. I haven't learned to regulate my emotions. I've just put down the substance. And eventually that fails because we can't get sober on our own free will. And that's the belief behind that. So, who or what offers you support in tough times? I wanted to see what other kind of support system that she has. So she said my higher power, which she understands as God. She has made that clear to me. My Alcoholics Anonymous home group, which is a group that they go to regularly, and they can switch it up, but they go to this one mainly. Her meditation, her mindfulness techniques like mindfulness breathing, walking, mindfully eating, my family, and my connection with others. So sometimes she views the AA room as a higher power as well. And so as far as that, I wanted to just speak on the theoretical framework. And I look at it from a social learning theory, that what was modeled to us and what we experienced and what we saw and what was taught to us, we tend to pick up those ways, right? So if you grew up in a Christian home, you tend to take on those same values and beliefs. And that's not always the case. We change as we grow sometimes, and we start questioning things. But in her situation, my interviewee, she grew up in a home that was atheist. I mean, there was no spiritual outlet, there was no spiritual belief. So she really found that through getting sober, which I thought was really interesting. So that's just the way that I see it. And I like to come from a strength-based perspective too, is, asking them what their strengths are, and how do they support themselves, and how do they get through tough times. Because if they're coming to me and they've experienced certain situations and they've made it through, it means they have the ability and the strength to get through whatever they're going through. So I need to recognize and know what those strengths are, and to help play off that, right, in therapy. So that is all I have, and I will upload part 2. Thank you.